Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. I'm really excited about today's guest, Carl Richards, host of the podcast Solutions Made Simple. It's going to be a fantastic conversation about podcasting, the nuts and bolts, the new era of marketing, and I love bringing guests such as Carl on the show to show you what's possible. So, Carl, welcome.
Thank you, Christopher. It's great to be a guest on your show. I'm glad we were able to connect.
Yeah. Kind of tell people, set the stage, how you got started, your background, and we'll dive right into it.
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? Like I was born and then we'll start from there, but no, seriously, this journey started several years ago. I spent 25 years in radio broadcasting, and it's not a career I was probably supposed to be in because I stuttered when I was younger,
Yeah.
but it's amazing the number of people that have speech impediments that do make that transition into broadcasting. Anyhow, after quite a while in broadcasting, they say you haven't made it in broadcasting until you lose your first job. I finally was fired after about I don't know 13 years in broadcasting. Yes, I made it. And then during that time, I was looking for something to do. I didn't even think I'd get back into radio. And I started a part-time business as a speaker trainer. And through some great opportunities that were presented to me, I got back into radio, but still maintained a part-time business doing speaker training with the intention it would go full-time, but it never did, unfortunately. But what happened though, you might have heard about this, Christopher, was somewhere around 2019, 2020, was this thing called the pandemic, I think they called it. That's when a lot of things went kaflooey in the world, and including the broadcast world. The advertising dollars, they plummeted. I mean, revenue dropped by 70%, 80% in some markets. So there was a huge attrition of people. So that was an opportunity for me to finally take my business full time. The challenge was nobody was getting on physical stages. They were getting on virtual stages. So I had the opportunity to then take what I had learned in launching my own podcast back in around 2018 to take that and turn that into a business of not only training people to how to get their shows up and running, but then to help coaches, consultants, high level thought leaders and managers and CEOs get their podcasts up and running too. And that's where we're at right now. And that's how it was birthed, was through not only having a podcast, but then helping other people through a very tumultuous time in our world get their podcasts up and running.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I love the moving back to March 2020, that brings so
Oh
much
yeah.
memories and yeah, it was interesting leveraging between physical in appearances to virtual, and you basically could do, five keynotes in a day in your pajamas if you wanted. Um
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of talk, you really would talk about podcasting and also speaking, and
Sure.
you're a three times best-selling author, you're a TEDx speaker, you've clearly mastered the art of storytelling. So how do you integrate these skills into your podcasting approach to captivate and engage your audience?
Oh gosh, I think storytelling is maybe even more important in the podcasting space than it is on the physical stage. It's still important on the physical stage because you can
Yeah.
move an audience forward more with a story than you can facts. And I think that's evidentiary when we look at some of the uh, large what do you call it, franchises that are out there. You know, Star Wars isn't a well-known franchise because of all the technology and spaceships and shuttles and laser beams and things like that. No, it's because they want to know the story of, is Princess Leia going to marry Luke, or is she going to marry Han Solo? No, that's why, right? It's the storyline, and that's a big part of it. So when you can implement stories or examples that are basically stories about things that have happened in your career, in your journey, in your experiences in life in general, then that's where I think you're going to win your audience over more, because people like facts. There are people who definitely digest them. That I have a spouse that reads technical journals all the time for whatever reason. I'm, what are you doing? I'm reading about a car engine. Okay. But for a lot of people, we need that story. We need to know, we need to understand, and we connect with you more if there's a story. So it's very easy to, I say easy, but I think one of the hardest parts is firstly structuring your content so that you allow yourself to not only get the facts out there about whatever it is that you're talking about, but then you can also implement the right story. And everyone, Christopher, I'm sure you agree with this, everyone has a story. or everyone has a series of stories that they can weave into as they're sharing about their experiences that they can tell. It's knowing what story fits and where. And that's where a little bit of structure comes into putting your show together. But it's really, once you have that down, sometimes the stories come naturally. And what's interesting is, and I'm glad you mentioned this, is that you record your podcast and then you strip it down and then you give the best version of that, when you release it. There are some people who think, I'm just going to go rogue, I'm going to go live. The problem is, live, you might not get the right story out, right? Or you might make the odd mistake. I've already made a couple mistakes today, but you really want to make sure that you encapsulate the best version of yourself. And if you've got some really good stories, you want to make sure the right one fits. If you make a mistake on it, you can always say it again and in the recording, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love how you talked about everybody has a story in them, and everybody has a book in them.
Yep.
And yeah, it's so interesting because I'm so fascinated by how technology has infiltrated podcasting and also public speaking. And I, I'm curious about your thoughts on how technology has in court like both podcasting and public speaking, because now you could do a modern day speaking tour on YouTube or on a podcast, and just like I said, from your bedroom in your pajamas, and nobody would know, and you can get the reps in by going live and speaking on YouTube and all of these different platforms, probably 24/7 practice. So what are your thoughts?
I think what we're going to see in the next, and I don't have a crystal ball, by the way. I'm only guessing. I wish I had a crystal ball. Wouldn't that be cool? Just look at it. Oh, that's what's going to happen in the next little while. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, what we're going to see, maybe even sooner. But I think what we're going to see is all those live events that people attended. I think we'll still see a live component, but I think what we'll also see is a hybrid version of it, where some speakers, maybe even some of the audience members, will be attending from a virtual aspect as opposed to traveling at some far corner of the world to attend. Because the one thing that, I live in Canada, Canada is a very vast country from coast to coast, and it's very challenging sometimes to go to an event that's only 2 or 3 days. If you're in BC and there's an event happening in Quebec, well, that's a 3.5 hour, 4 hour flight. That's a day there. And then the 3.5, 4 hour, 4 hour flight home, that's a day. And then you want to be at the event a day early. Well, that's now 3 days. For a two-day event, that's 5 days. So if it's geography is the challenge, you can attend virtually, unless you want to invest the time and the money in travel and stuff. But I think it's also the convenience for people who are, for example, I was at a convention recently, and a number of the people unfortunately took ill and weren't able to travel. They could still participate, but they couldn't be with other people, right? Just like back in the COVID days, where it's like, okay, everyone self-isolate and do your thing. These individuals, had viral infections and weren't able to attend. So in that sense, you can have people attending. You can have people attending from different countries if they wish to, without having to travel around the world. But the other thing that's interesting is the technology that's being used for those events. And not just the technology of, how do you amplify or 2.0 a Zoom call to make it that much better. There are now platforms for virtual presentations, but above and beyond that, some of the technology that's being used at these events. It's not just microphones and PowerPoint projectors anymore. There are different AIs that are being used, or different types of technologies that are really bringing it together so you can more efficiently host not only an in-person event, but a hybrid event or even a totally virtual event, and make it seem like you're live on location. So I think that's where we're going to see it in the next 3 to 5, 5 to 10 years, is a hybrid approach. And I think those diehards that want to attend and be at those events, they'll still go for the handshakes and the camaraderie, but there will be a lot of people who I think will tap into those events from afar, through a virtual portal.
Yeah. Yeah, not to mention, plus the travel hassles, the travel delays, the weather delays, flights are never on time and get
Yeah.
canceled. So,
That's
um,
why podcasting is great too, because especially if you're a speaker, the event I was speaking of was a speakers convention. And wow, there are a lot of professional speakers that after a while, I mean, you might be a road warrior when you're in your 20s and 30s, but when you hit your 50s and 60s, you get a little more tired, right? So certainly those virtual platforms or those podcasts or whatever it is make it so much easier because, like you indicated, you can do a podcast in your pajamas if you want, and you can do like three or four, five, six presentations or episodes as you were in a day, and that's as good as being on a physical stage, right? So it's about efficiency and best use of your time, but also, do you really have the physical or mental desire, especially as you get older, to want to be traveling 300 days or 250 days out of the year just to speak on physical stages or attend physical events? So I think that's what we'll see.
yeah. Yeah. And I know a lot of, for example, a lot of conferences, they have the physical in person, but then they
Mm,
also live stream it through YouTube, and
yep.
like you can just get the whole event on YouTube instead of have to go and fly there. I think the networking is the plus, and I know
Mhm.
speakers, a lot of speakers, they go to events and conferences, and they create a Twitter space or a clubhouse,
Yep.
and then for their audience and community that can't make it. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
for sure.
w-
Yeah.
which yeah, which also it's really interesting because you mentioned AI, and AI is part of kind of the big. It's going to probably be bigger part of the conversation next year. But
Hmm.
I'm really interested in how you see the metaverse playing out, because now you can put on like a Oculus or a HoloLens and go into like this room and give a presentation. You can create an event. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Hmm. Hmm. I haven't actually delved into that much, but certainly AI as a whole is impacting. I was going to make a joke and say AI, whatever are you talking about? But certainly it's certainly rearing its head, isn't it? And I think what we're seeing right now is AI has been around for a while, let's face it. I mean, it's not new, but I think we're seeing it like we've never seen it before. I mean, I remember what 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 years ago, the first robots coming out, service robots, things like that. But I think what we're seeing now is AI, and it's being used in our everyday worlds like we've never seen before. Even when you go to a restaurant, fast food restaurant, and order your meal now, your first stop is usually a technology booth or window or kiosk. Then you order your meal, or you order it on your phone before you even leave your house, if you even leave your house, and then it somehow magically is ready for you at the counter, or it arrives at your door, right? So there's a lot of those things that are happening now. But I think with AI, in the sense of podcasting or content creation, I think we're still a ways away from it taking over, if I can use that phrase. And I don't know if we'll ever see it take over, because there are some things that AI can do very well. AI can take an audio recording, for example, and transcribe it into text. The challenge is it's not perfect. It's only good up to about 92 to 94%. You still have to have somebody scan it, make sure names are correct, spelling, capitalizations, and all of the words, which, if it's really good audio, no problem. If it's less than perfect audio, or if your guest, for example, has a very thick accent, the AI might not pick up on that if it's not used to it, right? So it does take some time for AI to be trained, if it can be fully trained to our advantages. But there are some AIs that do very well, but it's still, and I use AI a little bit in my show when I need to. But one thing I'm noticing about AI is it's not perfect. And we think the AI is going to take something that's already less than perfect, say, for example, audio quality. It's going to take my audio quality that's not perfect, and it's somehow going to magically make it perfect. And I always share with people who are coming into the podcasting space, and they'll say something like, "Do I really need a microphone? My computer audio is pretty good." And I'll say, Do you want to put the best version of you out there? Anyways, every now and again, we have to clean up episodes. And I can tell by listening, this is 25 years being in radio, by the way. I can tell by listening if something has gone through AI. I can tell. That's how keen my ears are. Either that or they're dirty. But I can honestly say I can tell if it's gone through AI because I can hear the AI tendencies or how AI takes a pause. It doesn't have that warm, rich feeling that the human voice does because certain parts of it are removed. Similar to back in the day when you would take a record and record it to a cassette. That's how old I am. You take a record and record it to a cassette, and then you take that cassette and record it to another cassette. It loses a generation or two of sound quality. And AI does remove a layer of sound quality in its effort to make your audio sound perfect. So I can hear it. And until it becomes perfect, as I said, we're still a ways away from that. But there are still some great ways that AI can be used efficiently. I already mentioned one, the transcription, and it will clean up some of your background noise and things like that and does make it sound decent. But we really need to think about the humanity that's behind the work that we're putting into it. And what AI cannot do, it cannot recognize emotion. And I don't know if it ever will. Mark my words, if it does, we're doomed. But it cannot recognize emotion yet, seriously. And there's certain things that emotionally a human can anticipate. And I speak of this from the professional speaking world, that you know how long of a pause is enough to have a message sit with your audience before you say the next thing. AI doesn't know what that is, and it's going to be different every time a speaker changes. So you, Christopher, for example, is different from me, is different than Oprah Winfrey, is different from you name them. So if you have AI and it's programmed to do this one thing, and Oprah gets on stage, and I get on stage, and you get on stage, and 12 other people get on stage, AI isn't going to know all of the emotions that we individually are trying to impart on our audience in that moment.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll get there, but I think we're a ways off.
Yeah. Yeah. And so kind of what talking about, your company Podcast Solutions Made Simple focuses on helping professionals elevate their brands through podcasting. And then can finally elaborate on how hosting a podcast can be a transformative speaking opportunity, especially for coaches, consultants, and speakers.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. Here's my philosophy. Imagine, and we sort of talked about this a little bit already, but imagine, Christopher, if you could deliver 52 speaking engagements every year, no lost luggage, no delayed flights, no lumpy pillows or uncomfortable hotel beds, and you basically could deliver 52 hours. You get to speak 52 times a year in front of your ideal audience, knowing they will buy, maybe not all of them, but let's say maybe 40% of them will make a purchase from you at some point in the next calendar year. As a speaker, would you turn that down?
No, I mean it's so much more efficient, right?
That's a podcast. That's a podcast. And when I say that to speakers, they go, it's almost like their jaw hits the floor. It's like I've reinvented the wheel for them. So that's essentially what that is. And that's why for coaches who are vying to get on these stages or vying to get in front of these large audiences, and there's nothing wrong with that. As I say, I love live events. I really do. But I still recognize the value, and I have a podcast, and I speak on virtual summits more so than I speak on live stages. I actually do my goal of the next couple of calendar years is to speak on virtual stages as much as I do physical stages, as well as podcasts. Now, that might sound very aggressive, but really, when you look at it, virtual stages, as you've already said, are really easy to speak on. If I get on a podcast a week, that's 52 episodes. If I get on between 4 and 12 stages, physical stages in a year, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I don't need to be on a ton of them. When you think about it that way, when you think about the virtual stage as your playground, because your ideal audience will likely always be in front of you. If you have positioned your content the right way, you can't lose. You
Mm.
can't lose. Where the mindset gets to be a little bit wonky is when people say, yes, but I want my podcast to make money. Well, that's the wrong thinking. We want our podcasts to generate revenue into our business as coaches, consultants, high-level CEOs. We want that business to come into our company. We want them to hear what we have to say and then go over to our website, tap into our products and our services or our intellectual property. For a podcast to make money, it's the wrong thinking. Your podcast makes money when you have built an audience. This is another discussion altogether, but your podcast starts to generate more revenue as you continue to build your audience. But
Yeah.
to bring people into your business, that's what you really want. And there are multiple types of podcasts out there that are structured differently: sports, comedy, true crime. Those are some of the top podcast categories out there. Those, of course, will probably look at sponsorship dollars or all kinds of different ways to generate revenue that way, or crowd-based funding like through Patreon. But as far as how a business podcast works, it really works through bringing people in through the content to your website, and then that's where people can tap into your other products, your freebies, your services, your live events, your virtual events, whatever they are.
Yeah. And for kind of those thinking about starting a podcast, everybody should start a podcast, by the way. And then
I agree. I totally agree.
yeah, kind of elucidate the differences between what's the difference between a podcast, a radio show, a YouTube channel, webinars, kind of elucidate these, and then also how do you what are the biggest things that deter people from starting their own show?
Oh, sure. Let's start with what's the difference between a podcast. Basically, if you understand the history of them, this will probably quickly answer the question. Podcasts started out years ago with somebody who has hit a higher pay grade than you and I put together, and everybody else on this planet, probably Christopher. Started out by this guy, and I forget his name. Figured out that when you take a podcast, when you take an RSS feed, and RSS feeds back in the early 2000s, they were for text or they were for print. And he figured out a way, and I wish I could remember his name. You might want to look it up and put his link in the show notes if you can figure it out. He figured out a way to take audio, to take an RSS feed rather, and put audio down it. Hence, podcasting was born. Okay, so podcast started out as a video, as an audio platform. It's since evolved to people who have video podcasts. There's nothing wrong with that, but I've already expressed that there is definitely power in audio, especially good audio, because without good audio, you don't have video. If we were to do an experiment, if I just stop talking and move my lips, that's a video. That's why I did that for you, by the way.
Yeah,
You can use that later if you want. But
yeah,
that's basically, you need the audio even with the video, right?
yeah,
Unless you think back to the movies of the 1920s, they were called silent movies because they were silent, but you still had music that evoked emotion. You had text on the screen that would kind of give you a better picture as to what was going on. But without that, without the music, without the text on the screen, all you would have is somebody moving their lips. You wouldn't know what was going on, right?
yeah.
So you need that audio in order to make the video sizzle that much more. How it's different from radio: radio is what I like to call appointment tuning.
Hmm.
If you listen to the 8 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news, or coming up after 7:30, it's this contest, that's appointment tuning. Whereas podcasting is on demand. In other words, you engage with that content when you want, which means if you're a night owl and the best time for you to listen to podcasts is between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., great. But I defy you to go and listen to your favorite radio station at 2 in the morning and hear your favorite DJ there. It's not going to happen, right? You might hear something, maybe they did a recording or something, but you're not going to hear your favorite show then. So podcasting allows you to put content out there, allows it to be there it's there forever. The podcast content lives there forever. That's why for podcasters who have abandoned their shows after a little while, because for whatever reason, the show's still out there, but it lives there forever. Unlike, as I said, broadcasting, where in a lot of cases it disappears. Now we have the technology to be able to archive some of that content, but a lot of the original radio content, it's gone. It'll never ever come back.
Mm.
How it varies from YouTube, though, is YouTube is a great platform for people who want to share video content, but YouTube is only one platform. It's a behemoth of a directory. That's really what it is. It's this massive directory of nothing but content that people have put there. Here's the challenge with it. Sorry, YouTube. When you upload your content there, you don't own it anymore.
Mm.
It belongs to Google. So Google can do whatever they want with it. If they want to manipulate it, if they want to put ads in it, I guess if ads go into your content, okay, I guess you're doing well. But if somebody complains about your content, Christopher, on YouTube, guess what?
Mm.
YouTube can go, thank you, goodbye, trash, done. And that happens more often than you think. Not only that, I think a lot of platforms, YouTube being one of them, but even when we look at social media platforms too, they can decide what's most important. And I remember when YouTube always wanted they wanted long form content. The longest form video content, that's what's going to get you the traction. Give us those 30-minute videos. So what did people do? Started doing 30, 40, 50-minute, hour long, 2 hour long video things, pieces of video content. And then this other platform, maybe you've heard of it, Christopher, TikTok,
Yeah.
came around, and YouTube went, wait a minute, what are you doing? What are you doing here? You can't. Oh, well, okay. Okay, YouTubers, new game plan. We'll still take your long form content, but if you have something that's 60 seconds long, we'd love to see that. So
Yeah.
they can manipulate and do whatever they want and promote or highlight whatever they want. So I'm not saying don't have a YouTube channel. I'm just saying that understand that. Whereas podcasting platforms, you have a lot of flexibility and you control the content. And when you put it out there through an audio platform, it's going on multiple platforms. It's going
Yeah.
on 15 or 20 different platforms that will people can listen to it portably. In other words, I can listen to this show when I'm at the beach. I'm going to Mexico soon. I'll be able to listen to the podcast. I won't need to look at anything other than the sand and the surf and listen to a podcast. So there's the portability factor. So I hope that answers that question. I know it's a long, drawn about way to get to it, but it's different from radio. It is actually leading the charge above linear content.
Yeah.
And the advertising dollars are proving it because more people are more inclined to make a purchase from things that they've heard on a podcast. So all of those things are really shedding a positive light on podcasting. And yes, obviously, if you have a video podcast, I'm not saying stop, but I'm saying recognize the value of the whole or all the layers of what a podcast can bring you. And I can't remember the second question because I just kept talking.
No, no,
Second question.
that was wonderful. It's all basically different forms of content. It could be short form, long form, putting on
Yep.
basically different mediums, different
Sure.
formats. Um,
Yep.
the how is it different than webinars?
Oh, very different than webinars. Webinars, again, I believe webinars to be appointment tuning. You sign up, you
Yeah.
attend, and I find webinars too to be very pitch oriented. As in, come to my hour-long webinar. I'll give you about 10 minutes worth of content and then
Yeah.
about 55 minutes or 45 minutes worth of
Pitching.
pitch, right? So that's why I actually don't, I've hosted webinars. I don't want to say I hate them because hate's a very strong word. I
Yeah.
loathe them. Let's maybe use that word. I would rather, I would rather say, you know what, listen to my podcast. You want to listen to something of value? Come
Yeah.
listen to my podcast. Here's a podcast that's all about how to be a better speaker or how to be a better podcaster, how to be a better interviewer.
Uh-huh.
I can give you that information on a webinar and then sell you something for 15 minutes, or I can give that to you on a podcast and say, by the way, we're having a workshop or an event in Tennessee
Yeah.
this date. Or by the way, if you want to attend virtually, you can do that too. Click the link in the show notes. I can do that and maybe even get better traction from it
Mm. Yeah.
than I can a webinar because and people know when they attend webinars, they're going to be sold to. They're going to be sold to. And some
Yeah.
people don't want to be sold to.
Yeah. How
Right.
can people contact you, check out your social media, follow you, reach out to you, etc.?
Yeah, podcastsolutionsmadesimple.com is probably the best place to do that. We also have a podcast called Podcast Solutions Made Simple. I like things simple, so I named the podcast the same thing. But certainly, when you go over to the podcast, you'll find more information too about some of the boot camps that we hold for people who are looking at getting into the podcasting for the first time, or reviving or reframing their podcast. Our boot camps are great for that. But
Yeah.
other information too, you can always reach out. My current email address is askcarl@carlspeaks.ca, which is still stemmed from my original speaker training business. But certainly reach out. I'm always happy to have a conversation with you, or follow me on social media too.
Yeah. And for all the audience out there, let's thank Carl for bringing his wisdom and expertise. Be sure to check out his podcast, as well as follow his social media. And with that, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
Christopher, thanks for having me as your guest.